The first hammer strike echoed like a gunshot through the dirt. She didn't flinch. Her name was Ruth Doran, and she wasn't mad, though folks across the snowy ridge whispered it behind frost-bitten hands. "That poor widow," they'd say, "digging holes like a prairie dog, while the wind howls." But they didn't see the frostbite scarring the side of her son's face. They didn't hear her daughter's teeth chattering under 3 layers of quilts. They didn't know what it felt like to hear silence in a child's chest because the night took all the strength for breath. Ruth knew, so she kept swinging. Her spade hit rock. She knelt down, fingers numb, shoulders trembling, and worked the chunk loose. She had no blueprint, no architect's wisdom, just something her dead husband once muttered in passing about warmth being found under the ground. That was back when he was building their first cabin, before the fire, before the frost, before the fever that took him inside a week. Now the mountain air smelled like salt from tears that never fully dried. And Ruth Doran dug because she had no other choice. Nobody came to help. They watched from the safety of log walls and glowing stoves while she vanished beneath the snowdrifts each morning, reappearing only as dusk dragged long orange shadows across the ridge. Some shook their heads, some laughed, and one, Samuel Cray, a bearded rancher with 3 strong boys and a porch stacked 10 feet high in pinewood, stood at the edge of his property line and shouted after her, "You planning to tunnel all the way to California, Ruth?" She didn't answer. She just kept digging. She passed through soil, then clay, then ice-packed loam, laying logs above her as she went to keep the roof from caving. She laid them, rough, crooked, sometimes just 2 planks thick. The tunnel wasn't pretty, but it wound beneath her land like a blind snake. By week 2, her back was so knotted she could hardly stand. Her hands bled through the old gloves she'd stolen from her husband's coffin trunk. But she carved down and down until one morning she struck a layer of dark, compressed air so still and warm it made her gasp. She stopped digging. She didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of her half-collapsed woodshed with her children curled up on either side, their bodies pressed against hers for heat. Her oldest, Nathan, barely 10, had started coughing again, the kind that came from deep in the ribs. Her daughter, June, whimpered in her sleep, skin cold against Ruth's arm. Outside, the wind screamed like a ghost loosed from the canyon. The thermometer nailed to what was left of their cabin wall read 35 degrees, and that was before the worst part of winter. So at dawn, Ruth went back into the earth. She widened the tunnel mouth. She built a frame. She salvaged boards from their burned-out barn, hammered them into shape with the same bent nails she'd pulled out of the scorched walls 6 months ago. She patched holes with straw, with hides, even with torn-up curtains, and deeper in, where the air had settled and refused to move, she laid a floor of packed mud. She dragged stones in from the creek and built a fire pit. It took her days to get it just right, digging out a venting hole that wouldn't collapse, lining it with broken stovepipe sections she'd begged off a trapper. That was when the first neighbor came to look, not to help, just to stare. It was Clara Fromm, a young mother whose own baby had died in the freeze last January. She didn't say much, just stood by the edge of Ruth's snow-piled yard, with her shawl wrapped around her, blinking slow at the tunnel entrance. "You building a grave down there?" Clara asked. Ruth wiped the dirt off her cheek. "No," she said. "I'm building a home." The woman stared a little longer, then left. Word spread. By the end of that week, half the settlement knew what Ruth was doing. They called it the Mole Den. Samuel Cray made a show of warning his kids not to play near it, lest they catch whatever made the widow go feral. A few laughed. Some felt uneasy. Nobody offered to lend a shovel. But Ruth didn't need their help, because when the wind came screaming again, louder, longer, and meaner than it had all season, her children didn't shake with cold. They were underground, wrapped in furs, laid against heated stones, sleeping on straw beds Ruth had carried down 1 armload at a time, crawling through the tunnel with her elbows scraping the sides. And when the storm turned to blizzard, when even the strongest men in the valley had to shovel snow off their own roofs by lantern light, Ruth didn't emerge at all. Her tunnel was sealed behind a wooden door, reinforced with stone and sod, and beneath it all, the warmth held. It didn't rise to the level of comfort, not like a rich man's hearth, but it was survivable. It was steady. It was not the kind of warmth that flickered and died with the last log in the fire. It was earth warmth. It was stillness. It was life. Nathan's cough stopped. June's shivering slowed, and Ruth, who hadn't slept in nights, finally allowed herself to close her eyes beside them, pressed to the curved dirt wall of a space she'd carved with her bare hands. Outside, neighbors fought to keep their stoves lit. Inside, Ruth held her children close and breathed. But it wouldn't stay quiet for long, because once the snow lifted and the sun rose above the ridge again, The real trouble came, this time not from cold wind or hunger, but from the very people who'd once mocked her. They came knocking. The first knock was light, then came a second, harder, closer to a fist than a knuckle. Ruth sat upright where she'd been resting near the fire pit, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. The noise echoed strangely through the tunnel shaft, muffled by soil and softened by the straw-packed walls she'd sealed with her own hands. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it, but then it came again, this time with the unmistakable scrape of boots on the packed snow above. She looked to Nathan. He was sitting up too, blinking the sleep out of his eyes, his hand already on June's shoulder. The girl was curled in a tight ball, her breath a slow, even rhythm that meant she was still deep in the calm of sleep. Ruth touched her son's arm, whispering, "Stay with her." She pulled her coat over her shoulders, tied it shut with the twine she used in place of buttons now. Most of those had fallen off weeks ago, and crawled toward the tunnel mouth. Her knees and palms moved with muscle memory more than thought, past the small fire pit, past the storage nook with the dried apples and jerky, past the cracked lantern she used sparingly when candle stubs ran low. The packed mud under her hands was warm from the heat she'd built up overnight, but it cooled quickly the closer she got to the entrance. Ruth paused by the last bend before the tunnel exit. She had built it deliberately narrow here, so the wind wouldn't barrel through. She pressed her ear to the side of the wall. "Ruth?" A man's voice called down through the wooden door overhead. "You in there?" She knew that voice, gravelly, confident in a way that grated. "Samuel Cray." "I am," she called back. "What do you want?" A pause, then another knock. Less a request, more a demand. "You all right down there?" She hesitated, then said, "We're warm. We've got food. We don't need anything." Another pause, then a different tone crept into his voice. "Storm hit hard. Took out my stovepipe. Damn thing cracked clean off. We've been without heat all night." Ruth closed her eyes. She could picture his cabin, the tall roofline, the thick chimney with the black soot streak down one side. The boys, big, strong, probably huddled with their mother around whatever coals hadn't burned out, and Samuel, pacing, angry, not just at the weather, at himself. "Sorry to hear it," she said, and moved to crawl back. But the voice came again, sharper now. "Let us in." That stopped her. "You mocked this tunnel," she said. "You called it a grave." "I did," he admitted, "and I ain't proud of it. But that don't change the cold. Don't change my boys shivering in their boots. You've got heat. We don't. Let us in." She sat there for a moment, hand on the frame of the tunnel wall, staring into the shadows. Her heart told her to say yes, that it was the neighborly thing to do, that no one deserved to freeze. But her memory screamed louder. She remembered Samuel laughing when she first started digging, standing with his friends on the hill, beer in hand, shaking his head like she was a stray dog building a nest. She remembered how nobody came to help when she was hauling lumber across the ice. She remembered June coughing up blood last December, and Samuel refusing to trade his spare medicine for anything less than 3 pelts. Pelts Ruth didn't have. Now he stood outside her door. Ruth crawled to the entrance and unlatched the hatch from below. It groaned as she lifted it. Samuel stood above her, hunched against the wind, face red and chapped. Behind him were 2 of his sons, both looking down with wide, scared eyes. "I have room for 2, Ruth said flatly. "Not 4, not 5, 2, he bristled. "My wife's near froze." "Then send your boys. They're young." "I'm not leaving her." Ruth met his eyes. "Then you'll need to fix your chimney." Silence. He didn't argue, but he didn't move either. Finally, Ruth said, "You've got tools. Use them. You think this tunnel built itself?" She shut the hatch before he could reply. Inside, she secured the bar across the door again and sat there in the dark for a while. Her breath steamed in the narrowing light, not from cruelty, but from necessity. There was barely room for her and her children as it was. Any more bodies, and they'd be sharing not just space, but air. Heat didn't last forever in a dugout, no matter how clever you thought it. She crawled back, heart pounding. Nathan looked up. "Someone needed help?" She nodded. "They're all right, just had questions." He didn't believe her, but didn't ask more. That night, Ruth sat awake by the fire, eyes fixed on the low-burning flame, wondering how many others would come, and whether she'd be able to turn them away, because the storm wasn't over, not even close. By week's end, the tunnel mouth had been knocked on 7 times. Some came softly, like Clara Fromm, who whispered through the crack in the door that her newborn's skin had turned blue that morning. She didn't ask to come in, just to borrow heat. Ruth gave her 2 heated stones, wrapped in cloth, and warned her not to let them touch the child's skin directly. She never saw Clara again. Others came angry. One man, Abel Shaw, banged on the hatch so hard the wooden bar holding it cracked. Ruth had to reinforce it that night with extra beams she'd planned to use as shelves. He shouted things, accusations. "You hoard in heat down there, while the rest of us suffer. That ain't right, woman." But Ruth had stopped listening to shouting men a long time ago. She reinforced the vent pipe with stones so no one could pour snow or worse through it. She taught Nathan to listen for footsteps above and to hush his sister if strangers lingered. The tunnel wasn't just a shelter now, it was a fortress, and it needed to be, because things above were unraveling. Reports came down the shaft through whispers and warnings scratched into small notes left under rocks near the entrance. Clara's husband, who still brought Ruth scraps from time to time in quiet thanks, told her that 2 cabins had collapsed from snow weight. A family had burned their table legs for heat. Someone else had been found half frozen near the creek trying to fetch water that wasn't ice. And yet Ruth's fire still burned. The tunnel, insane, foolish, disgraceful, had held. Even in the face of the worst winter the ridge had seen in decades. Her children were alive. They were warm. They smiled again. Nathan even started reading the old paperbacks his father left behind, whispering chapters aloud to June in the evenings. They were surviving, but survival, Ruth knew, had a price, and the ridge wasn't finished collecting. It happened in the dead of night. Ruth woke to the sound of the tunnel shaking. At first she thought it was wind, then maybe snow shifting. But then came the distinct sound of pressure on the walls. A thud, then another. Low, deliberate. Something was outside the main entrance trying to dig in. She sat up fast, her body already moving toward the front. Nathan stirred. "Ma! Stay," she said sharply, grabbing the shovel she kept near the hatch. "Keep June close." She crawled forward fast, the warmth fading from her back with every foot she gained. The air grew colder, tighter, until she reached the door. It rattled under impact. Someone was trying to pry it loose. She listened. Voices. 2, maybe 3. She recognized one, Abel Shaw. "Get that bar off," he hissed. "Ain't no law against surviving." Another voice, lower. "What if she's got a gun?" "She don't. She's got dirt and rocks." Ruth's breath came slow and hot from her mouth. She moved quickly, grabbing the metal pan she'd used for cooking. With the blunt side of the shovel, she pounded it against the side of the tunnel wall. A thunderclap inside the narrow chamber. The noise echoed like cannon fire. The voices stopped. She did it again, twice, harder, then silence. Nothing but the sound of retreating snow crunching under boots. Then, eventually, even that faded. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, when she finally lifted the hatch, she found a knife stuck in the beam beside the entrance. No note, just the blade, a warning, a promise. Either way, Ruth knew now, warmth made you a target. So she dug deeper, not into the hill, but into the earth behind the main chamber. She extended the back wall, carved a second chamber, hidden from the first. She lined it with the same care, filled it with supplies, taught Nathan how to crawl there if something ever happened. Because a storm was one thing, desperation was another, and men in desperation did not think with the parts of themselves that could be reasoned with. But Ruth was no longer building just a home. She was building a line, one between them and everything outside that wanted to take what they hadn't earned, even if that meant facing it alone. The knife stayed in the wood for 3 days, not out of oversight or laziness, but purpose. Ruth wanted whoever left it to see that she had not flinched, that she did not retreat, that the tunnel, strange as it may have looked from the outside, was not hollow beneath the surface. She left it there as a kind of answer, sharp steel catching the light when morning sun angled just right across the white powder covering her yard. If they came back to check, and she knew they would find the blade still wedged deep, untouched, and would wonder what kind of woman leaves a weapon in plain sight. That was the game now, and Ruth, unwilling or not, was part of it. She rationed their firewood tighter after that, not from scarcity. She still had a decent pile stacked near the far end of the tunnel, kept dry under canvas, but from strategy. Smoke was visible. Smoke rose. Smoke said, "We're alive down here and warm." She started burning in the evenings only, when the sky had blackened fully, and only using rocks she preheated through the day, wrapped in thick cloth to retain the heat. June didn't notice. Nathan, perceptive as always, noticed everything. "Are they going to try again?" he asked one night, voice low. "They might," Ruth answered, not lying. "Will you stop them?" She stared into the dim flame, flickering in the fire pit like a nervous candle. Her fingers twisted at the hem of her shawl. "I will," she said finally. "But we might not get to stay." His eyes widened. "We'd leave the tunnel." Ruth shook her head slowly. "Only if we have to." And with that, she made the hardest decision she'd made yet. Harder than building the tunnel, harder than turning away a freezing man, harder than sleeping next to her children with a shovel across her chest. She would show it to one person, just one, not because she wanted to, but because survival, long-term survival, wasn't going to be bought with isolation and distrust. It had to be built with the right alliance, and there was only one name that came to her: Clara From. Clara's husband had been seen walking alone on the ridge last week, his face worn and eyes ringed in blue. Rumors said their baby hadn't made it through the last storm, that their roof had cracked down the middle, that Clara had taken to sleeping in the barn, next to the livestock, just to keep warm. It wasn't pity that led Ruth to her. It was memory. Clara had been the only one to speak to her kindly in the weeks after Ruth's husband died. She hadn't offered help, hadn't pushed in, but she'd looked Ruth in the eyes and said, "If I were you, I might do the same." It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone else gave. So Ruth waited until a clear day. Rare, sharp sunlight spread across the snow like a mirror. You could hear your own breathing under it. The cold wasn't warmer, but it was gentler. The wind slept for once, and the sky held no threat. Ruth left Nathan in charge, gave him a loaded slingshot, 3 stones, and instructions to hide with June in the second chamber if anything seemed off. Then she stepped out into the world again. It had been nearly a month since she'd stood under open sky. Her tunnel mouth was carefully disguised now, with layers of pine branches and snow-patched cloth. From 20 feet away, it looked like a storm-damaged well. She adjusted her scarf, pulled her hat down tight, and walked. Clara lived a half-mile down the southern slope. It wasn't far, but the cold made each step stiff. Ruth moved with practiced speed, eyes scanning the ridge. She didn't knock on the door. She went to the barn. Sure enough, Clara was there, hunched over a small calf, stroking its side with one hand, the other cupping a metal bowl of slushy grain. She looked up slowly when she heard footsteps. Her face was gaunt, pale, but not empty. Ruth spoke first. "I need someone I can trust." Clara blinked, said nothing, but she didn't turn away either. "I built something," Ruth continued, "under the ground, and it works. It keeps us warm. It keeps us alive." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You want help?" "No, I want you to see it, to understand it, so if I vanish, or worse, someone knows how it was done." For a long time, neither woman moved. Then Clara rose. She walked to the barn door, set her bowl down, and nodded once. Ruth led the way. Clara didn't speak until they reached the tunnel. She ran her fingers along the entrance, eyes squinting at the way the cloth had been cut to look like weathered rock. When they climbed down together, Ruth lit a lantern from a hidden compartment and waved the smoke with her sleeve so it wouldn't trail above. The descent wasn't easy for someone who hadn't done it before, but Clara managed. When they reached the main chamber, the warmth hit her like a breath. She stopped, her mouth parted slightly. You built this?" "I did." Ruth watched as Clara's hands touched the curved walls, the dried mud packed around the edges, the bundled furs and layered blankets. She saw June sleeping on the straw bed, arm tucked around a cloth doll, and Nathan sitting cross-legged beside a small box of matches, carving a scrap of wood with a knife barely longer than a finger. "You have space," Clara said quietly. "Not much. You could take people?" "No," Ruth said. "I can't, but I can teach." And then she handed Clara a map, not a real map, a drawing, scratched on a piece of bark, with a charcoal stick, showing the layers, the supports, the angles, the fire pit, the venting system, everything she'd done. Clara held it like a relic. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Ruth murmured. "Just don't tell anyone you came." Clara looked at her then, truly looked. "You're the only person on this ridge who isn't freezing." Ruth nodded. "And that's why they'll come." And they did. By the next week, 2 more families had tried to build shelters underground, but failed. One collapsed within 2 days, flooding with meltwater. The other caved in on itself. Panic spread. Men argued in the square. Rumors started that Ruth had used something dark, cursed the ground, or worse, that she'd been lying about her tunnel all along. They wanted proof. They wanted warmth. They wanted her home. So they came at night, 6 men, one with a lantern, one with a hatchet, and all of them angry. Ruth woke before they reached the hatch. She'd placed loose stones near the trail, trip markers. When the first boot sent one clattering down the hill, she was already at the second chamber, waking Nathan and clutching June to her chest. She did not wait. She lit the emergency wick soaked in bear fat. The fuse wound through a gourd split in half, lined with dried dung and saltpeter. It wasn't a bomb, but it was smoke, thick and noxious. She shoved it through the vent shaft and braced. The smoke burst from the top of the hill like a geyser. Men screamed. One fell. Another dropped the lantern. When the snow caught fire, brief and bright, they scattered. Ruth waited 30 full minutes before she opened the hatch and doused the embers. They never came back, but the next morning, she found something else outside. Not a knife, not a stone, a note nailed to a tree. It read only, "We'll wait for spring, but when it comes, you're leaving." Ruth stood there staring at it. The sun was pale that day, offering no warmth. The cold had settled into the earth like a second skin. Beneath her feet, the tunnel still held. Her children still lived, but spring was coming, and with it, new choices, new dangers, and not all of them from the outside, because something inside Ruth had begun to change. A thought she could not shake. What if they were right? What if the tunnel wasn't salvation but a trap? And what if, in building it so well, she dug a place they could never leave? The first time Ruth questioned the tunnel, really questioned it in her bones and breath and marrow, was when she heard June whisper, "Do we live underground now forever?" The girl hadn't said it with fear, only curiosity. She had been folding a scrap of cloth into a makeshift doll dress, her face glowing gently in the lantern light. But the question twisted inside Ruth like a knife, because for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to wonder the same thing. Not aloud, not in front of the children, but that night, long after they were asleep, Ruth sat awake against the curved wall of packed loam and straw, staring at the fire pit and listening to the quiet heartbeat of the earth. Forever. She hadn't built the tunnel to last forever. She'd built it because she had no other way, because her husband had died in the freeze, and their cabin had burned, and the ridge was merciless to the weak, the poor, the widow with 2 small mouths to feed. She'd built it to survive. But the longer they stayed below, the more she realized the tunnel didn't just protect them from cold, it protected them from people. And that, Ruth now saw, was dangerous in its own way, because winter would end. It always did, and when it did, the world outside wouldn't welcome her back with open arms. The note nailed to the tree had made that plain. "We'll wait for spring, but when it comes, you're leaving." She read it every morning now, just to remind herself. She didn't remove it. She wanted it there. A reminder, a promise, a noose already tied. The ridge wanted her gone, and that meant she needed a plan, not just to survive, but to escape. She started with maps, what little she could remember of the region. Their ridge sloped southeast, with the river forked down low beyond the canyon. 2 days' walk in good weather, 5 if the snow lingered. There were smaller settlements beyond the tree line, ones that didn't know her name, places where a woman could arrive, say little, work hard, and vanish into obscurity. But she'd need to wait for thaw, and before that she'd need supplies, packs, blankets, tools, and most of all, secrecy. It wasn't just about getting out. It was about getting out without being seen, because the ridge was watching her now. They hadn't forgotten the smoke trick, or the screams, or the fact that while others lost toes to frostbite, Ruth and her children still had color in their cheeks. They didn't understand the tunnel, and what people don't understand, they destroy. So she began preparing in silence. Nathan helped, quietly, obediently. He was old enough now to grasp the edge of danger. He saw it in the way men's eyes narrowed when they passed the woodshed, in the way no one spoke to them in town unless they had to, in the way the storekeeper, old Milt, stopped giving her fair trade weight on flour. Still, Ruth scraped what she could. She tanned one more hide, bartered some cloth, stashed jerky under floor stones, hid extra boots in the second chamber. She even began lengthening the tunnel itself. It was grueling. Her hands bled. Her shoulders screamed. But every night she carved a few more feet further into the slope. She wasn't just building now. She was digging toward escape. And all the while the air grew warmer. Not much, but enough. By mid-March, the river ice cracked. They could hear it from the tunnel, distant but deep, like thunder under the earth. The first signal that winter's grip had weakened. Days stretched longer. Sunlight lasted past 6. The thermometer still dipped low at night, but the fierce 35-degree winds were over. But Ruth didn't rejoice, because that also meant spring had come, and with it, the men. They came without hats, faces bare, boots muddy from the melt, 5 of them this time. Samuel Cray led them, jaw tight, eyes cold. Abel Shaw stood just behind, arms crossed. Clara Fromm was there too, not among them, but watching from the edge of the trees. Her baby was wrapped in a sling across her chest. Ruth stood above her hatch, arms folded, shovel stuck upright in the snow like a stake. "You said you'd wait," she said. Samuel stepped forward. "We did. You said I'd be gone in spring." "That's right," Ruth nodded slowly. "And if I'm not," Samuel's mouth pulled tight, "then we'll make sure you are." It wasn't a threat in tone, it was a flat promise. "Where would you have me go?" she asked. "You burned every bridge, mocked me when I built, threatened me when I succeeded. Now you want me gone because I survived too well? You scared people," he said. "With that smoke, with your talk of going underground like an animal. That ain't how decent folks live. Decent folks let children freeze," she said coldly. "You think you're better than us?" "No. I think I was alone." The men didn't speak, but their silence pressed heavy. "You can stay," Samuel said finally, "if you tear it down." Ruth blinked. "Tear what down?" "The tunnel. Seal it. Fill it with dirt. Come back above ground like everyone else." "And if I don't?" He looked to Abel. The man stepped forward, swung an axe into the snow and said, "Then we'll do it for you." The decision was hers. She could fight. She'd done it before. But the tunnel wasn't just hers anymore. It was her children's, their shelter, their warmth, their home. And now it had become a weapon, one she had to disarm. So Ruth agreed, not in surrender, but in strategy. "I'll seal the front entrance," she said. "You'll watch. You'll see. But then we're even. No more threats. No more visits." Samuel nodded once. Fine. So she did it, board by board, plank by plank. She sealed the mouth of the main hatch with logs, dirt, stone, and snow. She packed it tight. She even lit the seal with a small fire to harden it in place. The men watched, nodding. They left satisfied. But they never asked about the back entrance, the one Ruth had been digging for weeks. That night, she crawled through the second tunnel, cramped, rough, barely supported, and emerged 30 yards behind the ridgeline, hidden behind fallen pine and brush. It took her 20 minutes to clear the snow and breathe air that wasn't stale. She stood and realized she was free, not in the way she once dreamed. Papers, travel, trains to big cities, but in the way that mattered. No one knew about this tunnel, and that meant she had time. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of quiet work. By day, Ruth and her children lived normally above ground. They took meals outside, pretended the tunnel was gone, chopped wood, waved to neighbors with stiff smiles. Nathan even helped mend a fence. By night, they dug, packed, and prepared. The tunnel extension now curved behind the tree line, down toward the first creek that marked the ridge border. Ruth mapped the route carefully, avoiding roots, checking soil for moisture. And on the night of the new moon, when the sky was black and the wind still, they left. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye. They crawled through the rear tunnel, dragging packs behind them, wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. The tunnel narrowed to a point where June had to be carried. Ruth scraped her knees raw, but didn't stop. Nathan pushed behind her, never once complaining. When they reached the far end, Ruth pried the hatch open and stepped out into the darkness. It was colder than expected, but clear. They walked all night. By dawn, they were 4 miles away. The trees thinned, the land dipped, and on the far edge of the ridge, where no one from the settlement ever bothered to go, Ruth found the place she'd been looking for, an old trapper's cabin, abandoned, half buried in snow. She broke the lock, carried June inside, started a fire. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And this time, no one knew where they were. No one was watching. No one would come with axes or knives or notes. The tunnel was behind them now, sealed, secret, forgotten. But its warmth lived on, in her children's skin, in her own heart, in the silence that no longer rang with fear. Spring had come, and with it, not exile, but escape. The cabin was little more than a skeleton. Its back wall leaned at a strange angle, like some giant hand had pushed it partway over and let go mid-collapse. The stovepipe had rusted out, and the door hung by one hinge. But Ruth saw not failure when she arrived there with her children, only opportunity. Shelter was never about perfection. It was about what could be shaped from what others left behind. They moved fast, even as exhaustion sank into their bones. Nathan gathered snow to melt, stacking it into buckets along the inner wall to thaw by firelight. June helped sweep dirt and dead leaves from the corners, humming to herself, her lips cracked from wind, but her voice sweet. Ruth scavenged boards from the broken front porch, yanking them loose with the claw of her hatchet, reusing the wood to brace the back wall before it finally gave out. There was no time to rest, not yet, because though the ridge now lay behind them, its people, its threats, its gossip and cold justice, Ruth knew they hadn't escaped everything. Word traveled faster than bodies, and spring melted not only snow but boundaries. Someone would come eventually. Someone would ask questions. Someone would want to know what happened to the woman who vanished in the thaw. But Ruth was ready now. She had learned how to hide in plain sight. They made the trapper's cabin theirs in small ways. Ruth hung the broken kettle over the fire, even though the handle was cracked. It reminded her of the tunnel pit. She sewed patches into Nathan's coat, then reshaped it smaller for June to wear. Nathan started carving again, this time not just sticks but spoons, small animal figures, even a tiny model of their old tunnel home with grooves etched into its side. "This was the big fire pit," he'd say, pointing. "And this is where I kept my marbles, remember?" June would nod and clap, and Ruth would smile, not saying a word. They didn't speak of the tunnel much anymore, not directly, but it hovered around them like a warm shadow, something sacred, something buried, like a body laid to rest. It had given them life, but it didn't follow them here. That was the unspoken rule. They were above ground now, and that meant starting over. By mid-April, Ruth had made contact with the nearest settlement, a trading post just beyond the North Bend, where travelers sometimes passed, and river trappers sold pelts. She arrived with her hood low and a sack of dried meat on her shoulder, and nobody asked where she came from. That was the gift of distance. In a new place, you were only what you said you were." She told them her name was Eleanor Reed, a widow, 2 children, passing through, looking for work. They offered her mending jobs, a place to buy flour, a cot in the barn, if the cabin grew too cold. She declined the cot. She had warmth. She had learned to carry it. What she needed now was anonymity and time, and for a while she got both. Spring in the North Country comes slow. The snow recedes inch by inch, like a guest overstaying their welcome. Trees bloom late. Ice cracks, then refreezes, then cracks again. But the air begins to change. It becomes less sharp, less cruel, and people breathe deeper. Ruth watched her children run outside again. Without mittens, without fear. They laughed. They gathered stones. They didn't look over their shoulders anymore. But Ruth did, always, because it was late April when the rider came. She saw him before he saw them, a figure on horseback, far across the bend, pausing at the edge of the low ridge, scanning the land like he was reading a map written in wind. His hat was down, his coat flapped. He wasn't a trapper, that much was clear. Too clean, too deliberate. A scout maybe, or worse, someone from the ridge. Ruth ushered her children inside, closed the door softly, and waited. The rider didn't approach, not that day, not the next either. But she found fresh tracks near the creek a few days later. Hooves, not boots. They were being watched, not hunted yet, but watched. That night she sat with Nathan by the fire, carving another spoon. He looked up and asked, "What if they come?" "Then we don't answer," she said. "And if they don't stop?" She set down the spoon and looked at him, not as a boy, but as something more, an equal, in this strange war they had survived together. "Then we go further." He didn't ask where. He didn't have to, because the tunnel had never really ended in dirt. It had ended here, and if needed it could be dug again, not the same way, not in soil, but in silence, in movement, in learning to make yourself small enough to survive. They had learned that lesson once. They could learn it again. A week passed. The rider returned. This time he came closer. He knocked once, then stepped back from the door. Ruth opened it halfway. She wore her dead husband's old coat, now dyed darker, the collar pulled high. Her face was older now, leaner, not the same woman who'd lived in a tunnel beneath the ice. "You Eleanor Reed?" the rider asked. "I am. You got a boy and a girl?" "I do," he nodded. "Just checking on travel logs. Had a family from the southern ridge disappear last month. Folks said they might have come this way." "I wouldn't know," Ruth said calmly. "I don't ask questions of travelers. Most folks around here prefer it that way." He tipped his hat. "Right, of course." Then after a pause he added, "Funny thing though, heard a story from back there. Said some widow dug herself clean underground, built a home in the dirt, said she kept warm while the rest of 'em froze." Ruth didn't blink. "Sounds like a story," the rider chuckled. "Yeah. Guess it does." He turned and rode off, and that was the last she saw of him. Summer bloomed fast. Green touched the edges of the trees. The river swelled. Trade wagons arrived more often at the outpost. Word spread of a hard winter. Folks told stories of collapses, frostbite, even death. But always when they spoke of the ridge, they ended on one note. She had the only warmth. It became a myth, slowly. They didn't say Ruth anymore. They said the tunnel woman. Some said she froze with her children in the dirt. Others said she'd been run off. A few said she'd become some kind of spirit, but none said she'd survived. That was the secret. That was the victory. Years passed. The trapper's cabin was rebuilt slowly, stronger, broader, with stone at the base and a proper chimney. Ruth changed her name again when she remarried. Her children grew. Nathan took up trade work. June read books to local children and taught sewing on Sundays. No one connected them to the tunnel, not even the rider if he ever came back. And when Ruth herself grew old, long after her children had children, she returned once, only once, to the ridge, not to reclaim anything, just to see. She found the place quiet, abandoned, swallowed by trees. No cabins, no fences, just the wind, and when she dug gently into the snow with her boot, she found the hatch still there, rotted, sunken, forgotten. She stood over it for a long time, then placed a small stone on top and walked away. The tunnel was never meant to last forever. It was only meant to last long enough, to hold her children, to hold warmth, and it did. It held, and because of that, so did they.